risk for imperialism, largely not even because there is malice there, but largely because these systems that came from the UK are so entrenched in Canada, these systems of imperialism and these systems of exploitation, that when there is something where an instance of exploitation in, for example, in South America or something like that, or in Yemen or something like that, Canada ends up on the wrong side of history just because we're accepting of it. And that, for me, comes from the executive. It really doesn't come from these like honorary positions. Sorry, that was maybe a bit rambly, but yeah.
I guess okay, all right. So yeah, I don't know how much. Well, yeah, I think basically it's a difficult one there because it's definitely one where you have is inherently institutionalized, right, and it's kind of normalized, but I don't know. I guess we're probably at a bit of a loggerheads there because I don't know. I know. I mean, we all have the right to different opinion there, and that my concern really is just that it's not dangerous till it's dangerous, and so leaving it around with even the potential of being dangerous is really shooting yourself in the foot. But yeah, basically, I think we're allowed to have our differences of opinion there. So I guess we should probably talk about something probably not as fun. Basically, let's talk about COVID. So numbers are going up. Morgana, are you in British Columbia now?
Yes,
okay, so that's interesting. So we'll have two different perspectives. So obviously in Ontario, we're seeing cases rise. We've got a terrific, just joking, Ford government, which is bungled pretty much every single possible level of resulting the pandemic to vaccine rollout. But I guess I'll ask basically Shelby or David in terms of Ontario, thoughts on the vaccine rollout.
I guess I'll go. I think it's horrendous. I heard something that apparently Ford is going to be having talks with Biden on purchasing some of the vaccines from the States. Don't know how true that is, but that's what I heard. I think the federal government has handled it terribly. On top of it, they could be in the process to be manufacturing vaccines apparently right now in Montreal and Saskatchewan. So there's that involved. On top of it, I think I don't really know what else to say about the vaccines other than the entirety of the Ontario's plan to help the people of Ontario was essentially to just ride on the backs of whatever the feds were doing, pretend like they knew what they were talking about when they went on screen, but actually did nothing substantive for the Ontarian people. And I guess that's really all I can say at the moment.
Yeah, I agree with lots of that. I think that in some ways it comes more down to the federal government than it does the provincial government in terms of rollout right now. Not to say the provincial government has done anything good. The provincial government has been very bad. I think so. I wrote an article for the Canada Files back in early December, late November, where I spoke to Matthew Green and I interviewed him and talked to him about the vaccine rollout. And back then, and this was even before any of the vaccines had been approved, it was kind of like my first hint that we were getting vaccines soon because Matthew was talking to me about it like it was like a very soon thing that was coming. But when I was talking to Matthew, he was telling me about the way in which and it's a little bit like legal, and I didn't really like understand. I had to do lots of research into it and everything because I'm not a legal expert anyways. But he's telling me about the way the government procured vaccines and how instead of buying vaccines, initially we bought options to buy vaccines from different companies, and how that's the reason, obviously now, why we're further down on the list compared to other countries, is because the Trudeau government wanted to boast the most diverse portfolio of potential vaccines in the world. Key word there was always potential, because these weren't vaccines we bought. These are vaccines we had the option to buy. We had like reserve them in a way. And because of that, that now means the countries who actually bought the Pfizer vaccine straight up long before it was manufactured, long before we did, have preferential treatment. And obviously the CEO of Moderna came on like the week later and was like, "Oh no, that's not true. Like you guys don't have you guys aren't any further down the list." But of course he's going to say it to the government. Like he's not going to tell, "Oh yeah, your government really botched that." Like he's not going to talk like that to the government. So yeah, I think that from the very beginning, this procurement process has been awful. The military rollout process also wasn't good for a long time and was very unorganized, disorganized in the way they were planning that and the information that Canadians had. And the privatization of vaccines is also a really important thing that Shelby touched on. It is funny listening to conservatives in the House of Commons somehow try to like do this thing where they're both talking about they're both trying to criticize, say, like communist China, for example. They're both trying to like the Communist Party of China and everything, while also trying to like grill Trudeau for not privatizing for not publicly funding vaccines, which is like an insane sort of gymnastics to try and do. Even in my head, like I can't. It is really funny watching it though. But yeah, I think in general, most of those problems come to the federal level, not necessarily to the provincial level. Even though I'm not gonna like rester à la maison isn't gonna like solve COVID anytime soon.
Yeah, for sure. And I think switching gears, basically, I'll be honest and say a bit more critical of the NDP's response as an oppositional force. I think has been mixed, admittedly, to me, because you look at like there's two prime examples, right? I mean, one of them, the first one is basically more, in my opinion, a false claim of a victory than a broken issue per se. But one of the things, again, I'll mention Jay Watts had mentioned was that basically back in, I believe it might have been March 25th, the NDP claimed that it had won sick days, right? And so basically you have a case where we're now in 2021, still not happening, right? So first of all, it's claiming false victories is one of the biggest things that kind of irked me there. And the second thing is the NDP pushed really hard for the Canadian emergency wage subsidy, right? And so that turned out to basically be a CEO and shareholder money giveaway. So basically now, I think this is getting back to BC because I'd wanted to because we had switched away without talking about this. So Morgana, obviously the NDP is governing in BC. How has their pandemic response been like from start to vaccine rollout and all that stuff?
So I will qualify this by saying I haven't followed this as in-depth as David has, so I don't have those specific details, but I can give you like an overall picture. That overall picture generally being that from like the fall on, we've basically had a much harder time. This is because a lot of reasons, mainly similar reasons to what's going on in Ontario with people not being able to take time off, and then the workplace outbreak. We've had some long-term care outbreaks. We've also recently had a scare with I don't know if it's an outbreak or just a single case, but the new COVID variant and some a long-term care home and things like that. The vaccine rollout, I'm not really sure in terms of, I'm not really sure how it's doing comparatively. Like I say, I don't quite have those details, but I do know that healthcare professionals are receiving the first dose of the vaccine currently. And I also do know that we didn't close schools quite the way Ontario did. We did close schools for a time, to be clear, but during this second wave that we're having, where we've actually had the most difficult time, we haven't closed the schools. And this is mostly anecdotal. This isn't something that I've looked into very deeply, but I do know that many teachers, in particular in BC right now, are struggling. They're having a really hard time. Yeah, it's actually devastating what I'm seeing from people in terms of how overworked they are, how much they are feeling tired of, and how much they're feeling tired of being stressed. That's what it is, because it's just constant stress working in a high school where the kids just aren't social distancing. They're doing whatever they want. They're kids, right? And I'm really hearing some cries for help from teachers and healthcare professionals that are like care aides, nurses, things like that right now. I'm hearing that they need support.
For sure. And it definitely seems like a theme here. I think all governments, well, I'll qualify the line with all governments have struggled. A lot of governments have struggled. Not all governments. I think some governments have handled it better than others. And look, I will bring up like basically the fact that in terms of lockdowns, right? Basically, one of the few places there's kind of like I would argue like two really prime examples of things being handled well. I'd say, like, for example, you look at New Zealand. I'll give New Zealand credit as like, even as like a capitalist nation, they've kind of been probably one of the best capitalist nations in terms of dealing with COVID. You've had, like, from what I know, it's a semi-normal state of life. And I'll give Jacinda Ardern, it's Jacinda Ardern, I believe it is. Yeah, I'll give her credit where it's due. And the more controversial one, but I would still argue fair, is the fact that China basically has handled, it did not do well to start. I think there's no dispute there. It didn't do well to start. But once the gravity had sunk in, basically they moved quick, lockdowns were severe, and you look at it, right? They were literally able to have pool parties in Wuhan by the end of the year. The economy is growing really fast there again, right? You wouldn't think that basically that would have been possible, right? But you basically have China being one of the few countries growing and pushing forward there. And I think basically, I'm not going to get into the bigger thing of whole systemic issues, but I think it makes a bigger case, right? I would argue for like socialism's ability as an economic system to withstand these kind of crises, but also in terms of the value, right, of basically just taking the measures needed to save human lives. It actually does benefit the economy, right? Because if you take that short-term pain for the long-term gain, you're actually going to see results at the end. And so when you see the entire country, and I don't know if it was the case in BC so much because that's one area where it's a bit of a blind spot, but it was just, oh no, the economy, and now you didn't lock stuff down, you brought everything back up as soon as possible, and then we're still in lockdown almost a year later. That's what economy gets
the same. It's all the same, really, because it is really this concept of us humans being very, very poor at realizing when we need to do something that's good for us in the long term. It's been absolutely the same thing over here, Aiden. I totally agree.
Shelby, I guess, David, thoughts on this?
I was just going to say that I think that there is also an awful lot of cognitive dissonance coming out of the fact that Canada is so close to the United States. And the United States is horrific right now. And obviously Canada, like per capita, I think we're only doing like twice as good in terms of deaths or something, which obviously twice as good is twice as good. But like America is horrific. And it's crazy that like that's our measuring stick. Like the worst country in the world in terms of the coronavirus is America. And we're like, oh yeah, at least we're twice as good. But compared to countries like you mentioned, China is a good example, obviously, as is New Zealand and Vietnam, and the vast majority of underdeveloped African countries as well are doing far better than we have and have far better responses. And there's lots of reasons for that, obviously. You could like write lots about that. But the fact that we constantly use America as our measuring stick, as being like, oh, we're not doing that badly, when there's a whole plethora of countries who are doing far, far better than we are, is really some different sort of like comparative politics going on there to make ourselves feel a lot better about the nearly 20,000 Canadians who have died because of this preventable pandemic.
Sure. So David, actually, you actually have quite a knowledge base on decent knowledge base on Africa. So would you maybe be able to talk and kind of, with whatever your knowledge set is, maybe take us through part of the reason why their response has at least been better than you look at some of the Northern American states?
Yeah, so it's funny because if you read BBC articles, the BBC for a long time really wanted Africa to like have an awful pandemic. Like all of their articles were like, oh no, this is gonna kill Africa. And the next article will be like, why isn't Africa like dying yet because of the pandemic? Like they were really awful. I think that there's a couple things, and obviously every country in Africa has different responses, had different positive and benefit, like good things and bad things that are happening. In general, the countries that seem to have the best response are countries like Rwanda, who have implemented measures that I wish we could do in Canada. I had a friend who over the summer from America traveled to Rwanda, and the way, for like some essential reason, the way it works in Rwanda is that you need to have a COVID test leaving America. You get to Rwanda, you get a COVID test in the airport, and then they send you to a hotel paid for by the government for one night, 24 hours, until the COVID test comes back. And then if you have COVID, then you need to quarantine, obviously. And that efficiency we don't have in Canada. Sorry, you guys losing me a little bit? My internet connection says it's unstable.
It lagged a little bit, but I could still hear you. So if you have more to say, you can keep going.
Sorry about that. I think it should be fine now. Am I good?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so I think Rwanda have done really well. Obviously, like, different countries are different, like, and obviously there's gonna be less people who are traveling these countries anyway to begin with. And I think that these countries, although obviously they don't have socialist governments for the most part, I do think there is a better sense in some ways of like a cultural communalism that we don't really have in Canada. And I think there's far more importance around that sort of thing than we have in Canada.
I'd like to jump in actually about what David said. South Korea also did an incredibly similar thing to what Rwanda did, where you have an extensive protocol that can last up maybe you think even up to 16 hours of you having to go through all of like a test, and then you might have to get tested again. You have to go into your own quarantine room and you have to do all this other stuff. And you're like, it's this huge process you have to do. And I think Canada should look at Rwanda, obviously, and also South Korea is very, very strict. If anyone's going to be traveling into Canada, we should be looking at South Korea's model or Rwanda's model. So I just wanted to bring that up with what David said. I know South Korea is a very similar one.
Eden, will you let me cut in for one more thing?
Sure,
I just
sure,
thought
yeah.
of something as Shelby was speaking. Another really big thing to keep in mind, though, is not really something to keep in mind, I guess, but just something that's been getting on my nerves, honestly, is people saying that, like, we can't do that because they're a collectivist country and we're a freedom-loving Western country, because that's like such like a problem, right? Like, because like we can't just say we're gonna do the thing that's bad for us because we're freedom loving. Like, that's not how this works. And that's something that comes up again and again and again, which makes me kind of think, okay, well, how could we sell this to our population? And that's something that I really have been thinking about lately, is how we could have sold this to our population. Now, my take has always been, you provide for people, they'll look after one another, right? So like if we made it so that people could stay home and could get on top of it, it would be okay. That's kind of been my position. But in terms of like the spirit of actually doing this, what are people's opinion on that? Because it has been something that's been getting on my nerves, that people just keep saying we can't do that because that's collectivist countries, and it's so scary when we look at like New Zealand as well and stuff, and then like they can get it done. So it's kind of like, where's our excuses?
I think a lot of it, sorry, do you mind if I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
I think a lot of it also has to do with the fact that like our federal government barely did anything, if we're going to be honest, when it came to supporting Canadians. And then on top of it, our provincial government did barely anything. We should have had mass rent moratoriums. We had somewhat of a mortgage moratorium, I believe, or something similar to that. But we should have had, I remember Nora Loretto said something, rather than $2,000, perhaps we should have even had $4,000. We should have made it a universal basic income rather than all of this really strict guidelines. We should have had a lot bigger shutdowns that the federal government should have tried to institute massively with the provinces from the start. We should have been doing things that South Korea was doing. We should have been doing similar things to what China was doing, with mass power washing of the streets and mass cleaning of the streets and the areas and mass lockdowns. But then on top of it, I think that it's an excuse, like Morgana said, it's a mass excuse for basically our government to sit around, do nothing, or do the bare minimum, and not help Canadians financially or help Canadians in general, when it, like with paid sick days and stuff like that. Well, we're a free country. Well, free countries also can give you a lot of basic rights and a lot of dignity and respect for being someone living in Canada.
Yeah, for sure. I think you made some great points there. Obviously, I think David's made some good points about obviously not the African nations basically not being socialist, but I would just argue that I think basically you think of like in terms of like inherently the system of socialism at its core, right, is one inherently collectivist. It's inherently of basically you have like, you think of it this way, right? When you have workers controlling the means of production and when you have workers in control of the society, right? Basically, you're going to have a society where everyone is thinking about themselves and about how to make each other's lives better. Because like, and I think this gets to a bigger point in terms of political disconnect in general, which I think is part of the reason why For example, all the premiers in the government got big approval rating boosts, despite not doing, most of them not doing a great job. Basically, is that when you have basically politics being about flashy figures and policies that basically never happen, or trade deals that are made almost by media and the government inaccessible to working people, politics doesn't seem that interesting. But like when you look at, like I'll mention like Cuba, for example, or like in terms of China, in terms of poverty alleviation, in terms of, I guess Cuba is, like, for example, the easier one to make the case for, where you see like local communal like councils and you see local democracy. Like you think of like all the decisions in terms of planning, in terms of where money goes, and like you think of like policing, for example. And policing is an interesting one in terms of like social societies. Talking to like Jay Watts, for example, I've kind of learned that there's kind of another side to the ACAB argument, especially for like socialist countries that are under threat of imperialist invasion, right? But in general, like you think of it, even there, basically under when these countries are under threat, right? It's local communities and like local people that are local representatives that at the end of the day are making the decision, right, to put money towards healthcare, to put money towards education. And so I think basically that's one of the bigger things about the collectivism, right? And that's the thing inherent with the like capitalist alienation, right? Is basically you have a political system which is designed to make people be isolated. And I think this pandemic is the greatest example of this, right? Because once you can't hang out with people in person, like most people feel severely isolated. And like some people have family around, basically, so it might be a bit easier. Like for me, for example, like even I've like realized the severe degree of capitalist isolation, right? Because I'm alone, basically. I'm not with my parents, and like it is weird as hell to be like on your own, like 99% of the time, right? Basically. And it doesn't feel like right for the human psyche. But like that's kind of like in the end of the day, right? It's a bit of a tangent on me, but it's kind of like that's what the system produces, right? And I think this pandemic has maybe shown the greatest example of. It's funny, like everyone says capitalism is human in nature, and I'll stop after this, but I would argue that this pandemic has shown that actually, I would argue socialism is human nature at the end of the day, right?
I actually want to jump in about that as a psych major. Actually, humans are inherently very social beings. And that's a huge misconcept that was pushed essentially by Milton Friedman, that we naturally are very selfish and that we naturally don't want to help people and we don't care about others. Well, when in reality, there's studies that were done and looked at in natural disasters specifically. You think that you would be very selfish in a natural disaster. And I'll be like, I'm not going to help anyone, every man for themselves. I'm going to get out of here. They actually found that people are more likely to stop and help people in natural disasters, putting themselves at danger to help others who are in need. It shows you that capitalism is not inherent in us, that we're socially collective, and that we work and thrive in groups. We thrive in a social environment. And so hence, when you have people, hence we have families, hence we have friends, and we form like socially collective groups. And that's why in the early days when we were in more tribal communities, we formed communities. We've always been social, and we are very social beings. And when we become isolated, you see depression and anxiety come. Hence, one of the reasons why doctors were severely scared for the second lockdown, because we are naturally social beings. And if we're going to be isolated for long periods of time, also to do with the winter, and lowering your mood. But that was one of the reasons why they're scared suicide rates are going to go up. So this notion that we are inherently capitalistic beings is unbelievably false.
Yeah, Shelby, so since you're probably one of the best people to talk about this, basically in terms of basically the mental health crisis and basically like a case for universal mental health care, would you maybe want to talk about that, like the logic behind something like universal mental health care?
Yeah, so currently in Canada, we have, I think it's, we kind of have like a two-tier system. I forget what it's referred to as, but it's like you have the private and the public sector. So right now, when it comes to most people, when it comes to getting therapy, unfortunately, you have to usually go through the private sector. You can go through the public sector, but it's because we're so underfunded in the psychiatric wards when it comes to our hospitals. It's very difficult to get one-on-one treatment. Or if you do get treatment, you're put in group therapy usually. Not saying group therapy isn't important, but when you need long sustaining therapy, which some mental illnesses do need, you can't seek that through the public sector usually. So you end up having to pay hundreds of dollars that usually when you have a job through your union or whatever, you have a package and it's through your job that you are able to get, let's say you get $1,000 in mental health care. So that means, let's say I have $100, I get 10 sessions are paid for, but what about all the other sessions of the year? What about the 46 other sessions that I'm gonna need during, I think it's a 56 weeks in a year, something like that. What about the 46 others that I'm going to need? That's not paid for. So, and I think it's disgusting that your mental health is tied to your job. So my ability to function in society, I have OCD myself. My ability to function perhaps in society is based on my ability to have a job. Well, what if I have a flare up and I lose my job for say, so then my mental illness is going to cascade. Or someone with schizophrenia, for example, who has a hard time holding down a job. Your pharmacare is connected to your job. So is your therapy. So someone with schizophrenia, for example, is going to have a much harder time, affording their expensive treatment, through their pharmacological treatment, and also their mental health treatment via therapy. And that is unacceptable. And I think Canada needs to put that under our Medicare system and be completely publicized and paid for. I don't think we should have a single private sector therapist in Canada. I think it should be completely publicized, and anyone who is practicing under will be charged with an offense, because it is unbelievable how many people in Canada, some people walk into a merge saying I'm suicidal and they will be told to go away because it's not considered a threat at this moment in time.
So I guess Morgana or David, basically, do you have any thoughts there, or like, I don't know, like I'm not gonna ask to relate personal experience because that's obviously personal shit. But basically, I guess your general thoughts on that. I mean, especially I guess I can ask from your perspective as students. Obviously, Shelby's a student as well. So whoever wants to go can go.
First, I'll just cut in with my one disagreement with Shelby. Everything you said was fantastic, except the one thing I disagree with about the private sector. I think it's probably good to have private sector therapies in, specifically for things that aren't like hard mental health science type thing, because people do like a lot of supplementary type things for their wellness and maintaining mental health. And if we had that universal thing, then like I don't know, I think it would be fine to leave like alternative types of medicines and therapies as like a private sector thing. I think that would be fine. But other than that, I generally 100% agree with Shelby. Personally, one of the things that I care a lot about is preventing crime. And how you prevent crime. It's not mental illness, not just mental illness, because like mental illness doesn't like cause people to commit crimes. But like Shelby was talking about, it might make it so they're not able to have a job anymore. It might make it so they're not in school anymore. And then those things are associated with more crime, because what happens is, if you're not going to be having these systems where people feel invested in their life and they also feel invested in their community, this is another thing that relates to what we were talking about like smaller, tight-knit communities in the past versus right now, and alienation that we feel from one another, that sort of thing. Like those smaller, tight-knit communities, people would be less likely to commit crime because they were held accountable to on like an emotional and social level to that community. They felt accountable to that community. And so when we look at crime or any of these other social ills, so much of the time it's connected to the fact that we just haven't gotten something figured out for mental health. And one thing I wanted to ask as well, if David had a comment on this, or Shelby or somebody, was how you feel about the provincial systems of healthcare and how that has impacted the delay in upgrading this. Because I feel like if it weren't for the fact that this is such a logistical challenge, I feel like we would have done more as a country. And that just might be a weird instinct, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'm going to jump in quickly. So I know that Chrétien and Martin specifically cut a lot of Medicare, I think, funding to the provinces. So that obviously has to do with the massive lines. I'm going to assume, I don't know for sure what has happened, but I'm going to assume the Ontario government itself, under our multiple conservative and liberal governments from the 90s and 80s, have done that, and NDP, and Bob Rae, the NDP, sorry.
As NDP too. So.
Sorry, no, I just forgot. It's not that I was actually.
No worries,
Bob
no
Rae
worries.
was terrible.
I'm not doubting you there. So.
I'm just gonna be honest. I don't agree with everything the NDP does, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm very critical of them, but so from the 80s and such, NDP, Liberal Conservatives, they have cut and cut and cut and cut, like our Medicare. I'm not 100% sure of the logistics, but I know for a fact that they have cut long-term care, for example. I think under Harris was it? They cut, and then he ended up going into like the private sector, and then profited off of himself cutting long-term care, and so that also plays a big deal in it, but also the federal spending when it comes to Medicare also has been cut.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the province, both in terms of education and in healthcare, have never recovered from Mike Harris's administration. I think that was a big reason why we're in the position that we are right now in Ontario specifically. I don't know if I necessarily agree that the sole reason why we have the issues that we have right now is because it's too much of a logistics issue to rework it. I don't know if I 100% follow. I think that it kind of comes a little more to an ideological thing. I think that for whatever reason in Canada, our specific brand of liberalism has this position where they want to keep commodifying healthcare. And I don't think that's ever going to stop. I just don't see a world, especially under the current government, under Trudeau's government, under the current Liberals, I just don't see a world where we're going to get these big pushes to decommodify healthcare entirely. I think they still want money in pharmacare. I think they still want money in whatever. Like, I think they still want those to be privatized institutions. And I don't know what it is about Canada specifically, because obviously in the UK, these same things that we want to have covered in Canada are covered in the UK. Like Boris Johnson, obviously, who's a conservative, a Tory, ran on policies to fund the UK healthcare system more. Not that he didn't, but he ran on those policies. But that's how popular these ideas are in England. And in Canada, our brand of liberalism hasn't gotten there. We aren't on board with that. And I don't necessarily know if it comes into a logistical issue and versus like an ideological issue. I think that and when I say we, I don't actually mean like me or like the people of Canada. I just think that because the people of Canada tend to be overwhelmingly on board with these ideas. But I think that our government and the Liberals, who have been in power for the vast majority of Canadian history, have some sort of stake in the continuation of the commodification of healthcare. And I don't think it's going to change with mental health. And I'm not sure it's going to change with pharmacare even anytime soon. And that is disappointing because that can have real material impacts on real everyday Canadians in a way that very few other policies even would.
Yeah, and I think basically I can jump in and almost shift gears a little bit, because one of the damages of basically Liberal administrations, and unfortunately basically NDP administrations, British Columbia is probably the NDP is most commonly in power, but I believe they've been in power in Manitoba, obviously in Alberta as well, is there's a cross-Canada problem on all levels of our government in terms of housing. And we have a housing crisis for basically even for those who are able to have an income and are able to secure employment. But we especially have an absolute and utter crisis for basically homeless people and our homeless population, basically, that are obviously at any point when you're in homelessness, it is a crisis point, right? And so we have had a case since basically the 90s where we've been promised more social housing. We've been promised basically more building, and you look at it basically on all levels, right? And basically 25, 30 years on, we are basically we're still not building housing. We're still not building housing to an aggressive, bold enough targets. Basically, the Liberal government's targets are milquetoast at best. And so you have a case right now, and I can relate this personally because there's this group called Social Housing Justice Network. Now, they've been hosting some basically socially distanced and limited in terms of numbers, basically gatherings. This is pre-lockdown, obviously, because lockdown, you just can't do it anymore. But I was there for like many weeks, basically, and it was interesting to like be there, like to see anecdotally how many people really just didn't grasp the extent of the problem, and how many people like didn't know about, like on a Toronto level, like the landlord tenancy board, in terms of what is evicting renters every 60 seconds, right? Basically where they're evicting dead tenants because the system is so broken. Because as a Canada Land podcast episode revealed, Canada Land is interesting, but they do have some good podcasts. I'll give them that. basically on the landlord tenancy board, basically you have a lot of these adjudicators and lawyers being like directly connected to landlords, being very, very tied in, where there's repeated constant conflicts of interest, right? And so it's just a severely problematic situation, because when you're facing a pandemic, basically one of the major things is basically if you have homeless people that can't shelter, like someone like John Tory or Doug Ford doesn't even have a damn clue about, you can't shelter if your shelter is outside. Like that's the thing, right? It's the inherent, like, that's one of the biggest things of like kind of my issue with like liberalism, is quite frankly that basically you can say all the woke stuff you like, but if your actions aren't there, I mean it's nothing. It's not. It's more than nothing. It's active harm. So basically, yeah, I guess Morgana, maybe I can get a sense of like what I guess basically in the past few years, and then maybe your best grasp would potentially be on like more recently, obviously. Like what's the BC government been up to in terms of like housing and homelessness?
Yeah, so I know that especially since the NDP since they did get into power, there were many commitments made. However, we still have a insanely large unhoused population, and quite frankly, especially on the West Coast, I find it unacceptable. I find it absolutely baffling that we have not found a way to solve for this yet. In my own city, Victoria, there are constant attacks on the tent city that is down at Beacon Hill. And it is just baffling to me the amount of indignity that we are saying to people when we tell them, you must move, but I don't know where to put you. And I'm not going to put you somewhere where you're safe. Just move. That indignity is horrifying to me, especially on top of the fact that I don't know if anybody saw this. I don't know if it made national news, but not recently, a couple months ago, I believe, but the video came out recently of an unhoused woman in Vancouver who was set on fire, she was sleeping there and she was set on fire where she was sleeping.
Wait,
and
really? Whoa.
Yes, that was a real thing that really happened, and video came out quite recently, and we were just basically told the police have been looking into it. The woman didn't report it ever, because of course she didn't. She's an unhoused person who probably doesn't have a whole lot of trust in the fact that she's going to be supported, right? So just all of that, the amount of indignity that people are treated with, it's just horrifying. And it really comes down to the fact that we haven't been able to get it done. We haven't been able to build these houses for whatever reason. We haven't been able to build these housings. One thing that I've been considering in terms of looking forward is looking away from continuing to make these like big city centers bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and more costly, and making more housing that can't actually keep up with the population. So of course there's going to be unhoused people, and looking towards developing smaller and rural communities and having housing built there. I'm not really sure how the economics works out, but it's something that has been suggested to me, and I do think that it's definitely worth considering, because for whatever reason, for example, in Vancouver, Victoria, we're not keeping up with this unhoused population. We're not going to anytime soon. And quite frankly, we need to look to other options. And so if it's just a matter of we need to provide housing in areas where people don't want to live, well, then why aren't those places that people want to live, right? Why don't you want to live in these smaller communities? What can we do to make those communities a desirable place to live? Yeah, sorry, that actually got a little emotional just because I'm so like, yeah, this unhoused population thing is really starting to get to me. But yeah, anybody's thoughts are welcome.
No, it's totally reasonable. Sorry, I'll just jump in again because I have a little bit of experience. Now, one of the most remarkable things I've covered is the Air Collective's basically encampment protest. Now, this started in like mid-June, basically, and I only realized what was happening and then eventually went down near the end of the month. But basically, the Air Collective, it's the Afro-Indigenous Rising Collective. Now, I'm not sure if it's still operational, but they essentially set it up as because this is right around like, obviously the George Floyd protests. I think everyone knows about those protests, and so obviously those spread to Canada for good reason, and especially in terms of there was I can't remember the woman's name, but there was a 29-year-old, I think it was Afro-Indigenous woman that was really suspiciously fell from her apartment rooftop when there's only her and police and there's no camera. I feel like I'm trying to describe everything, but I can't remember her name. So basically,
Regis
yeah, Regis, thank you. And so basically, they kind of started to do an encampment in front of City Hall, right? And so it was one of the most remarkable things because there was so much about like housing I didn't understand at the time, and one of the biggest misconceptions, right, is in terms of, oh, there's shelters, and basically like if they just build more shelters, then they'll be fine. But that's the thing. When you have COVID and when the shelter system is set up in the way it is, and when it's so overcrowded, basically, even if you build more shelters, it's likely going to be overcrowded until you build a ton more. And even then, there's inherent problems with like shelter structure. And so basically, as a result, right, you have so many homeless people that basically went to this encampment, or basically would go to other encampments, because it was literally safer to be outside than it was to be in there. And this was a fortunate time, at least ish, because it's summer, right? So it's not as dangerous as now. But I mean, like I was fortunate enough to talk to one of the main figures in there, and basically just talking to him about like their experiences, why they'd set this collective up, and basically like kind of the issues driving it was really, really fascinating. But also, quite honestly, I spent a ton of time over there in the summer, and basically it was just some of the most educational experiences for me was just talking to people who are homeless, and basically talking to people who lived on the streets or lived on that, and just chatting with them like as a person, chatting with them as just someone that they kind of were aware of and basically they knew somewhat. So basically, and like getting a sense of their personal experience, like the personal struggles and like the failure of our system to deal with basically housing humans, which housing should be a human right inherently. Because at the end of the day, right, basically you need roof and shelter over your head, right? I think we can all understand that as a common logic here. And so when basically you're forcing people to basically live on the streets and live in that, I mean, like you think of basically people, the excuses being made of, oh, they have struggles, or oh, they've done these bad things. And it's like, it's the whole like basically like the theory of like economic desperation, basically that Marx talked about. And yeah, again, I'm paraphrasing here. I'm not naming exactly, but right. So when you have basically economic desperation, when you have desperation for basic survival, you're obviously going to go around the rules and go around the established legal structures where possible. And then that just becomes into a violent cycle. And it's kind of like the thing of capitalism, right? In terms of if you are a worker, in terms of if you are a good worker bee, the idea is that it's supposed to help you or at least give you sustenance. Now, that's not true, really. Basically, most workers inherently don't get anywhere close to don't get the share of their work. They don't have control of their workplaces. They struggle to get housing. They struggle to rent, even they struggle to get food. Like there's so many more and more people are relying on food banks. And so basically, but even then, right, even for the people that struggle it's remarkably minor compared to those of the house of homeless people. It's just a remarkable indictment on capitalist society, and that basically there's such a miserable failure to protect such a basic core human right. It's just a real indictment on our society as a whole. And so yeah, I share Morgana's anger and frustration there. I remember basically being there basically when the police basically tried to shut it down. And I remember being there when the police basically shut it down. And then they went to I think it was Dufferin Grove Park. I'm pretty sure it's Dufferin Grove Park. But like even going there, right, the experience, they fought back. They rebuilt kind of the encampments. They went to a new space. And then basically you proceed to have police harassment. And that police harassment just kept up for time and time and time and time and time. Like even when someone like Desmond Cole came to speak, the police were harassing. Basically, when Indigenous elders, Indigenous members of Indigenous nations came to speak and came to support, you had police harassment, which of course, surprise, surprise, with our colonialist, basically racist kind of police and our institutions. But at the same time, it's just because it's not surprising doesn't mean it's acceptable. And so when they were eventually shut down, which they shut down and they moved to a coordinated manner, I actually couldn't be there, unfortunately, that day to try to document it. But it's just a disgrace, really. And I mean, the thing is, there's so many more encampments like this all across the country. You have so many protest movements standing in solidarity with homeless people, and also like standing up against like the kind of like the racist institutions and the anti-homeless basically narrative that is pushed all across this country. And so, yeah, it's one of the biggest issues for me there. Now, I guess shifting it on to like David or Shelby, is there really any thoughts from you guys?
Do you mind if I jump in really quick? And then
Yeah, sure
I'd love
thing,
to hear
sure
Shelby, just like for 2 seconds. I just want to say, and I want people to like, also, you just mentioned Desmond Cole, and I think that any viewers who don't know who Desmond Cole is should follow him and keep up with him, because he is an amazing activist in Canada.
Oh yeah, for sure. Actually, he was like one of the people that inspired me. It was seeing him like go bat to bat with a star over basically their suppression of him and his work that basically made me realize that there might be a space for someone like me in the industry. Even had to be something I had to run, basically, like there was a possibility there. I just didn't see journalism. Once I saw what he did, basically, I never saw journalism in the same way again. So I put his Twitter in there. He's really someone that speaks truth to power. He's quite the great figure there.
Yeah, he's a great guy. I just want to say really quickly, and then I'd love to hear what Shelby thinks about all this, is I want to make it like exceedingly clear that the homelessness crisis that we have in Canada is 100% manufactured by the systems that we have. We have 5 times as many houses in this country that are empty than we do homeless people. 5 times. I think it's like 5.5 houses per homeless person. No, did I cut out again? I'm so sorry.
You can hear you. No, we can hear you.
Did my internet cut out?
No, just keep going in and we'll let you know.
Oh, wow, that's insane. Yeah, so we have 5 times as many in this country than homeless people. And it's completely manufactured. And that's a really important thing to understand when we're looking at this issue, is these are issues that could be solved, and that people are dying every single year, and people are starving, and people are in between everything. And for what? Just to like maintain the status quo? It's insane to me that it's such a big issue and something we need to find a solution to, when the solution is right there. We have empty houses in this country, but every single time politicians want to make a move towards doing something about homelessness, it's always ideologically driven. It's always performative action. Like John Tory turned the fucking Toronto sign red for a day to like show like solidarity with homeless people. Meanwhile, like your police force is going to these shelters and tearing them down in Trinity Bellwoods. Like, what is that? I don't understand. You're not doing a single thing. And it's so frustrating to see it. The solution is there, and no one wants to jump at it. No one wants to like have a real conversation about heavily taxing empty houses. And I don't mean like a little tax, I mean heavily taxing these empty houses, or moving towards reclaiming property. I know John Tory has like talked about supporting a empty housing tax, a vacant house tax, if that gets like tabled or whatever. But like I want like action. Like I want like some sort of like tangible thing that's more than just like words, and more than just like, I don't know, I want policies when we have this many empty houses and this many people dying of starvation and going homeless every single year in this country.
For sure. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And one of the things that I guess you brought up in terms of the fact that it being manufactured, and when you're 100% correct in saying that, is like it's an inherent like sociopathic nature of our leaders and of the system, right? Because basically the fact that these kind of, and I would argue kind of sociopathic leaders get into power is manufactured by design. Basically people that inherently do care about people or do try to solve these problems, the institutions are designed to force them out, push them out, silence them, or try to simply just sap their energy out there. And I think it speaks to psychosis, or basically, I'm not using Shelby can speak to it better in terms of psychology. I may not be using the wrong terms, but I'm confident about sociopathy, at least, in that our system and our capital system is inherently sociopathic, because it's putting reliance on the economy, on money, over human lives, right? Because you can, like, if you think about it, right, if a business goes down, you can bring the business back. The business isn't dead. It isn't a living thing. And despite what some basically courts in the US think, a corporation is not a living person. It's not. But a human, that human life, if it goes out, if it's extinguished, it's gone. It's gone forever. And it's never coming back. And so that's the biggest thing of my like hatred of capitalism at its core, right? is that it's this valuation of capital and of money over human life. And it's this intense, deep repression. And I guess this is getting to my general why I'm so interested in imperialism. And it's this repression of forces that seek to push against this, whether it's local movements, like you think of Latin American movements, indigenous movements, of basically peasant movements, are crushed so viciously, is because capital fully well understands that its system is broken for the 99% of people. But because it is the top 1%, it does not care. It will crush, murder, destroy, and ruin the lives of as many people, as many nations, and put them in as much debt and as much struggle as necessary to maintain power at the end of the day. So yeah, I guess that's my little rant. I think Shelby, if you want to speak to maybe the psychology of that, you're absolutely welcome to.
Yeah, there's actually a lot to do with that, and I've learned about it a bit in my psych courses. So there's a lot of layers to it, and I 100% agree with David. It's 100% manufactured. There is no way we can't house every single Canadian, or at least attempt to house every single Canadian in who is homeless. So a lot of people who are homeless also tend to have mental illness and also tend to have addiction. And so that's where mental health care and psychiatric care can really come into place. On top of that, people who tend to be homeless tend to be sometimes part of the LGBTQ community as well, the LGBTQ plus community. They tend to sadly, specifically trans individuals, tend to be subjected to homelessness as well. And we can easily solve the issue here with homelessness. We could easily do a mass federal housing program. We could have the public sector building homes, so creating jobs on top of that, and building homes for every single person in Canada. I had a lot to say and now I'm forgetting it all, but also on top of this is a pharmacological issue as well, where people specifically, there was a study done with people who have HIV. And I learned this in my health psych course. People with HIV are less likely to be able to take their medication on a routine basis, which is HART. HART is a very, very strict pharmacological process that you have to take daily. It's multiple different medications. You have to take them at very specific times, and you can live a very fulfilling life with HIV or AIDS while taking HART. If you don't have a house or you don't have your own home, it is very difficult to stay on the strict regimen that they have found. So people with HIV who happen to be homeless, even if they still have a job, for example, and they're having to, let's say, what we refer to as couch surfing, it's very difficult for them to stay on the very strict regimen of HART. On top of it, if we're going to talk about jobs, unfortunately in our society, for you to even have a job, you have to have a place of residence. If you don't have a home, or if you don't have an apartment or a place of residence, you can't apply for a job. So when people say, why don't homeless people just get jobs? Well, they can't because they're homeless. They don't have a place of residence to be able to put that down on their resume. On top of this, we could easily do, like I said before, a massive public housing strategy where the public builds homes and we can build even mass apartments and house many, many people in them. And we could even, on top of that, have psychiatrists come into those apartment buildings and deal with people with addiction, deal with people with mental illness. Pharmacare can also be thrown into it. There's a lot, but once again, it is manufactured. Also, I want to say something about the police. The police are here to defend capitalism. They're not here to defend us. If they're here to defend us, to be defending the homeless people from the capitalists who are trying to consistently get them off their land, get them out of the parks because they are disturbing my home dwelling. I don't want them in the park because they're too loud or whatever. If the police
I can speak to that actually, and I'll let you get back after, because being in Dufferin Grove Park, there are actually multiple occasions. I was there and basically just hang out like casually, right? So cause I did like a couple articles through the month, but I also was just there a lot, basically because I wanted to observe, and it was just a remarkable space. I want to emphasize like those kind of spaces, like it's not a dangerous group. Like this inherent myth of homeless people and of basically that being inherently dangerous is totally farcical. I felt absolutely safe being around basically people who are homeless and people who are organizers. I felt absolutely safe, basically. And there was they were able to resolve disputes in such a safe manner. Basically, you obviously weren't going to have agreement 100% of the time, right? But these people, when they, it's capitalist brainwashing, right? It's propaganda barriers, and I talked about this in a recent article, basically on a separate issue. But in general, like the propaganda barrier applies, and especially, I think, especially like on a level in terms of domestic politics, there's a propaganda barrier against homeless people, and it's this instant fear of, oh no, there's some homeless people. Oh no, there's a gathering in my park. Oh no, maybe it's a little loud. Instead of basically talking with them or trying to engage with them or trying to understand their situation, this capitalist alienation has trained people to be, oh no, let's call the cops and it's their problem. If they die or they get shot by the police, because let's be honest here, the police setup it's designed to protect capital. I think there's a way, if police were designed to protect people under like a social system, I think there is a future there. But under the current capitalist system, it does not protect people, right? And so it's so inherently broken. So yeah, I think Shelby, I interrupted you, so I want to let you go back if possible. So.
No, I was going to say, and that's actually important where it comes to social work, where social workers are vital and dealing with the homeless and are dealing with people maybe who are having a psychotic break. We had an incident in, I think Mississauga it was, where a young Black man was having, I think he was schizophrenic. He was having an episode. I think it was a psychotic episode, if I'm not mistaken. And he was shot and killed. He was tasered, I think twice, and then he was shot and killed, I think on his front lawn. Absolutely horrendous. We shouldn't be having the police dealing with our mental illnesses. I think we should be defunding the police and looking at an abolition of the police and trying to do other things to benefit our society and actually listening to activists and academics when it comes to this. But we're not talking about that at the moment, but there's a big issue when it comes to dealing with the homeless, and we automatically think we have to call the police. Well, we need to set up a different system with dealing with homeless people, and that is housing them 100%, and having professionals such as social workers being the ones to deal with. If there is disturbance or something, which there usually isn't, but if there is, it should be a social worker going, not a cop who's just going to escalate the situation and make it worse for the homeless people.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I think basically, at minimum, we really have to redefine the role of the police, and they do need to be defined, because right now they have way too much of a role in society. And I think that's one of the safest things I can possibly say there, quite frankly. Basically, it really is just cops have way too much power. They have way too much influence. And you have cases where cops are trying to do more things, or they're being to try to justify their power, right, and to justify that control. But like, it's just not your damn role. You're just not good at it. You're never going to be good at it. Your training, right? It's actually basically like, you think of, for an example, there's an example in America, right, which I'll bring up quickly because I know Shelby wants to talk, but where basically they were purposely hiring lower IQ officers that basically had less empathy and had lower IQ, because they don't want people that are going to be like, oh shit, this is bad. And like, you have so many examples of police where there's actually good per se officers that actually try to check these abuses and try to check these over abuses of power, right? And they get torn to shreds. They get targeted viciously. They lose their career. They're out of these positions. They're like under lawsuits. They're under so much trouble, right? Basically, and so as a result, right? That's the thing of where I think there's an absolutely under a capitalist system, it's an irredeemable institution. But also that the people that, like, not all people that try to go into the policing are inherently terrible people, but the system isn't designed to let those good people do work. And even if it was designed, right, to do good work, I just still think in the role of capital, of serving capital, you're never going to do a good job. But Shelby, I'll let you back now.
I was just going to say one thing that I just wanted specifically to do with homeless people as well, because a lot of homeless people tend to sadly have mental illness. I want to just say something, make something very clear that I learned from a social worker, is that people with mental illness are actually less likely to hurt you than you were to hurt them. And that's something that people really need to remember, that if you see someone, let's say, who has schizophrenia on the bus and they're talking to themselves, the likelihood of them hurting you is unbelievably slim. And to just ignore it, don't give attention to them, that could maybe cause what we refer to as a trigger effect that could maybe make them act a bit more abnormal. Just ignore them, let them be. Don't approach them. Just let them be. Don't try and hurt them or anything, because the likelihood of them hurting you is so slim. And so I just want to make that very clear, that people, even when they're having delusions, or maybe unless they're having like a literal psychotic break, then obviously, try and seek help. Please don't call the police. But try and seek help if they are clearly having a psychotic break and need help. But most people who are having delusion, like who are maybe having some delusions on the bus, are not going to hurt you. So I just wanted to make that very clear.
Yeah, so if either one of Morgana or David wants to jump, if you either one of you wants to jump in, you're welcome to, because I think me and Shelby have talked for a little while, so.
Yeah, I just wanted to second what Shelby just said. And I just wanted to second what Shelby just said about stigma, mental illness, and especially people with addiction, though that complicates things as well, especially out here where we have a very serious opioid crisis. All of that comes into play, and breaking down that stigma is like so important. One thing I wanted to mention about housing real quick though is that like while we have many houses in this country, not all housing is created the same. And that's something really important to remember. Like, I think I kind of brought this up earlier with like the location type thing. But like location of a house is, or like of a property is like so important. So like what Shelby was talking about earlier about like communities building housing in these actual communities that is in particular doesn't take up much space horizontally, if that makes sense, but is more dense housing. That really speaks and resonates with me with the current situation that we have in these cities like Victoria and Vancouver, because it doesn't matter that there's a house that's empty like out a couple, like 10 kilometers away, because that person's not going 10 kilometers away. That's where that person is. So like there's also that discussion around like meeting people where they're at and things like that. So like housing is just like such a complex thing, and I think I maybe used to oversimplify it a little bit before I started really understanding the experiences of people that are housing activists. Because when you talk to housing activists and things like that, we run into these problems, right? About location, about access to services, about if people are going to need to relocate to get housing and things like that. So I just thought that I wanted to mention that really resonated with me, the idea of meeting people where they're at and bringing the housing to them and building it, because that is really what we need.
And I think that part of the issue that housing activists and what you're talking about come up against is they're also fighting against the government as well. They're also fighting against a system that doesn't really want them to change it. And I mean, in an ideal world, we'd be lobbying the government to get them on side with more progressive policy changes around homelessness. That doesn't currently look like a very feasible solution. So obviously, I wasn't trying to, when I said that there's 5 times as many houses as there are homeless people, I wasn't trying to oversimplify the issue. Because obviously that involves government. And like a single like what you're saying, and I agree with what you're saying 100%, is that a single housing activist can't just stand up one day and say, all these houses need to be filled, because they don't have the power to do that sort of thing. One point I want to mention about stigmatization of addiction, which I think is important the way we think about things, is on Ryerson campus at my university, there's a safe injection site at the end of one of the streets. And it's really interesting talking to students about this and getting people's takes on it, because so many people say like really, in my opinion, fairly like classist shit about how they wish that wasn't there, and how it like ruins like the aesthetic of the school and all of that, which I think partly they don't appreciate the fact that downtown Toronto, aside from parts of Vancouver, is probably the poorest place, or at least the highest amount of homelessness in all of Canada. And they really appreciate that they go to school in that place. But I think also, like, those are stigmas we need to fight, because safe injection sites save lives. Like, objectively, they save people's lives over and over again. And I guess, like, and I have lots of criticisms of my university. I've got criticisms for days about things that Ryerson does and policies that Ryerson supports as a university that has some political power, obviously. But I think that Ryerson's general, the schools at least, obviously the safe injection site is government run, it's by the city of Toronto, it's not part of Ryerson. But Ryerson, as far as I know, is fairly accepting the fact that it exists there, and I don't know anything about them trying to get rid of it. And I think that in some ways, at the very least, that makes people who are otherwise very, very, very privileged students who are attending a school like Ryerson downtown Toronto, at least they have to come to terms with the idea every single day that they're walking past a facility, and hopefully one day they'll hear someone say things like what I'm saying right now. Not that my opinion has any sort of like transformative value, but they'll be a little more open-minded to the idea that these facilities are 100% vital. And yeah, of course, that's all I have to say anyway.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess before I go on, I think Morgana, you need to get going, right?
Yes, I do. Thank you for being such a gracious host, and thank you, David and Shelby, for speaking with me. You are both such wonderful and insightful individuals, so I look forward to speaking again. Thank you for having me.
Sure. I'm gonna try to get your Twitter quickly and just
Yeah.
I'm gonna try to link so if people want to follow Morgana, they can do so. And a 1, 2, 3 right in the chat. So thank you, Morgana. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too. Bye for now.
Bye. All right. So thanks to Morgana for basically being on there. But speaking to as like a Ryerson student myself, I mean, I've encountered a ton of similar attitudes. Like living in residence, the amount of people that I heard call like homeless people, oh, it's the crackheads, oh, it's all that, oh, I got yelled at by some crackhead, or I just got basically a whole bunch of like anti-homelessness statements, right? And like I'll mention propaganda barriers and like capitalist, like in this case, no, not capitalist alienation, not in this case, but I'll mention the propaganda barrier till the day I die, because it really is a propaganda barrier, right? Where people, especially young people our age, are as well. Like, I mean, so the attitudes are probably better in general, but they're still socialized to believe that homelessness is a personal fault, right? Not a societal failure, basically, and not a societally manufactured thing. And so, yeah, it's aggravating to me. Basically, I think I can echo David's experience in that there is like an anti-homeless attitude among some of the students. And I think like it's for example, like in terms of the Egerton Ryerson, the statue there, and the whole, you probably saw I co-authored a piece with Adam Riggio about the Ryerson campus conservatives being a bunch of racists who basically also basically had Aaron O'Toole basically like, oh, residential schools aren't so bad. Just casually fucking says that. Just casually genocide denied. Just casually like, oh, genocide. Oh, the genocide wasn't that bad, guys. It wasn't bad. It was fine. Here's how to win a debate about genocide. Let's try to win the debate about genocide. Who did less genocide? Oh, we did less genocide. Woohoo! We did less genocide than the liberals. We're so special. We're so great. No, you did genocide, you idiots. You don't get an award for doing less genocide than others, you fucking morons. Like seriously, it pisses me off, like the attitude at school sometimes, and I think there's like a bigger issue of like political alienation of Ryerson students. In particular, I've found that basically, I think David can speak to this as well, like especially with Ram Ganesh, right? The whole Mr. Fuck Up Man himself, Mr. Embezzler in Chief, basically going about and with our funds, with the credit card scandals. I think any like legitimacy that the politics may have had to students kind of died, especially with the Ryerson University using the RSU kind of crisis as an excuse to try to basically crush the union, right? And so as a result, basically, when you have Ryerson students basically alienated from politics on campus and in general, basically facing that propaganda barrier around homelessness, I guess it's not surprising in a sad sense that there may be a lot of pervasive homelessness, anti-homelessness attitudes, but I think we can certainly share the hope that I feel like there's definitely groups on campus and people working together to do that. I mean, one of the more frustrating things for me, like, because obviously I was formally involved with the Ryerson NDP, right? And like, they were kind of really disappointed to me because there wasn't like any concrete action taken by them, but there still is action being taken more in general by activist groups by them. Admittedly, my shame is I don't know their name. I don't know the names of these activist groups that are doing this work. And that's something a mission of mine to know and to learn. But I know there's at least a movement to get cops out of our schools, which is a good start, which is definitely a good start. And the fact that we have police in our school is inherently problematic. And so, yeah, you know, I have gone on a long tangent, and I think Shelby is out of the room.
She said she'll be back.
Oh, she said, she'll be back. Okay, all right. Well, David, I guess I'll ask you this question first, and then I'll switch to Shelby, because I think I'll ask one more question, and then we can kind of slowly wind it down from there. Basically, so let's talk about this, right? We've talked about the pandemic, we've talked about homelessness, we've talked about opioid crisis, we've talked about vaccine distribution, we've talked about Governor General, we've talked about a lot of things. But one of the biggest things and the most pertinent things coming to mind is a real risk of a spring election. Now you have basically you have a lot of activist groups and communities. You think of the Communist Party of Canada, you think of the NDP as well, right? In terms of wanting to avoid an election at this time, because you should be having solutions that benefit people instead of basically going forward and forcing through an election. And obviously, the NDP and Communist Party solutions are not the same, just to make that explicitly clear. Mm-hmm. But the point is, the desire of having no election is, I believe, fairly similar, right? And so I guess my question is this, right? Spring election coming up. Basically, question is twofold. A, what are your thoughts on having a spring election during a pandemic? Because we have had one with John Horgan's BC NDP, as well as basically your thoughts in general about who might basically benefit from an election coming soon.
Yeah, so I'm kind of going to answer both those questions at the same time, because I think they're really related. Because my issue with the idea of having a spring election is that I think that we might have the chance that no one benefits. I think that, and that's what I think that we have the chance the Liberals will just win another minority government, and we'll have roughly the same makeup in Parliament, and we'll have wasted all of these resources on campaigning and all this time during a pandemic when those resources obviously would have been better spent somewhere else. And that's the big fear for me, is that we're going to call an election a pandemic, and we're going to go through all this, and with no real changes in government. I mean, it's not impossible that the Liberals get a minority government. Sorry, excuse me. It's not impossible that the Liberals can win a majority government. I don't think Conservatives are going to. And the NDP, obviously, I don't think is going to make any sort of, might win a couple more seats, but probably aren't going to make any sort of, is that your cat? Sorry.
Oh, cat, hey!
I don't think that the NDP are going to make a considerably enough change in terms of seat numbers to make any real impact. So yeah, I do think it's a little bit irresponsible to be calling an election in a pandemic when we might just end up in the same situation that we're currently in. I don't know. Obviously, like Trudeau hopes that he can win a majority. I think that as every passing day goes on, it looks less and less likely. Because I don't think that the polling isn't necessarily coming in that as strong as the Liberals would want it to. And I think that, and I hope that I have lots of criticisms of the NDP as well. I do think that currently, the setup that we have right now, a liberal minority, and NDP with at least some seats in Parliament to like pass important things, is probably more beneficial than a liberal majority would be. I don't think that's a very controversial statement.
Yeah, for sure.
And I just think that the election is very, I disagree with it on a moral level, I think. I disagree with this idea that you're going to call an election. I think it's selfish, especially when it's not even for sure you're going to get the desired outcome for Trudeau's Liberals.
For sure. I think I agree with a lot of your thoughts, but I want to ask Shelby for thoughts first. So what I was asking David, I'm not sure if you heard it, we've discussed a lot. Immediate questions would be your thoughts on having a spring election around morals, ethically, around actual purpose, any benefit to it really. I mean, because the critical angle is that there's basically already been elections during a pandemic, like BC NDP government did that as well to secure a majority, right? So basically that question, and also in terms of benefit, do you think basically, who do you think is going to benefit from an election coming up, especially with the pandemic spiking the way it has recently?
So morally, I don't think we should be having one during a pandemic. And yeah, maybe it will start to go down a bit, but we're still in the pandemic. People are still going to have to risk their lives to go to the polls, or even risk their lives to go to the mailbox even and submit their ballot that way. On top of that, I was very against the BC NDP. I'm not a fan at all of the BC NDP. I want to make that very clear. I think they're horrible. I was very against the BC NDP doing their election. I thought it was disgusting to essentially secure majority government. But on top of it, I think the only people who will really benefit, obviously the Liberals. I agree with David. I don't know if they will have a full-on majority. It looks like they may. I think the Liberals and the NDP as well would benefit as the polling is looking. But I don't, whether or not, if it benefits someone or not, it looks like it's going to not benefit the Conservatives based on everything that has been going on. But I would prefer if we didn't have an election in spring or even summer for the selfish reasons that it's going to benefit either the NDP or it's going to benefit the Liberals.
For
Shelby, I
sure.
just had a quick question, if you don't mind.
Yep.
I think you're far more involved in the NDP than I certainly am, and know a lot more about it than I do. I was curious about like where you think the benefit is coming. Like, what is like a good election result for the NDP in 2021 election? Like, does it look like how many seats? Like
30. Like 30 seats at most. Yeah, I'm very realistic when it comes to this stuff. There's no way in hell the NDP are gonna like have a be an official opposition in the next election. There's no way. That's just my opinion though. I am very critical of the NDP. They should be doing a lot more than they are right now. I have no I just want to make this clear. I have no ties to the NDP. I'm acquainted to a couple of the MPs. I'm not the hugest fan of Jagmeet right now. I think he's all right, but I think, people like Nikki Ashton and Matthew Green could have been 10 times better, and people who actually identify as socialists, such as Leah Gazan, Nikki Ashton, and Matthew Green, and Alexandre Boulris. I don't know if you know of him. He's from Quebec. He's the only Quebec freaking NDP MP. But I would prefer if a socialist was, but once again, then there all comes in the fact that Aiden says they could be muzzled. We don't know. And so I just want to make clear, I have no actual affiliation with the NDP. I don't even donate enough to them to even be considered a member of the NDP. I just want to make that very clear.
All right, that's totally fair and good to know. I think a fair point just to be made clear, right? Basically, is the vast majority of those MPs are more social democrats rather than socialists, which is like inherently different. I had an interesting chat with a certain member of like the Communist Party, and one of the things they made clear is reading through like the text of like Marx and Lenin, you'll see that a communist is actually someone directly involved in part of a communist party. But in terms of also socialist, right? Just making it very clear in terms of the distinction between socialist and social democrat, right? At the end of the day, social democrat wants to reform capitalism as much as possible, constrain those class differences and those class clashes, right? Whereas a socialist wants to basically have worker control of society, right? And repress basically the rich and basically elements of like the bourgeoisie, basically at the end of the day. So just to make that little addition clear, though, I have no doubt Shelby's aware of that and David are aware of that.
Yeah. The NDP itself is social democratic, 100%. But
yeah.
100%, there's no way. They said that they were supposed to be originally democratic socialists. There's no way they are democratic socialists now, or like they're social democratic all the way. But individual MPs who I've spoken to, who I'm acquainted with, from what I've heard from them, they are on more the socialist end. A couple of them, not all of them, but there's a couple of them. I just want to say that.
Yeah, of course. Like it's not a absolutely black and white situation. But yeah, you know what? I think on that discussion point, we've been going for almost an hour and 45 minutes. And so I think this might be a good time to call an end to this first the Canada Files Canada news stream. So yeah, I guess I really couldn't thank David, I couldn't thank you, and I can thank you, Shelby, enough, as well as Morgana. Basically, thank you for agreeing to be guests on the show. It's certainly a show I have high hopes for, and one that I hope can kind of provide a left perspective on a genuinely firm socialist perspective on these issues, right? Because I think one of the weaknesses of the Canadian left has been that a lot of it is very focused on America. Think of Christophe Felice, David Duell. Love the two. They're great people, but they don't cover Canada. And at the end of the day, I think there's a desperate need for consistent coverage of Canada. So I'm really hoping people are excited for this, because I certainly am myself. But I want to quickly give David and Shelby any opportunities to like shout out any like stuff they're doing, any work they're doing, any like ways you can support them. I know, David, at least you have a Twitch, right?
I do. I am on Twitch. You can follow me, Mouseland. I haven't posted in my Twitch for a while now. I'm very swamped with school right now, but I hope to do more interviews in the future. I'm going to reach out to a couple more people. I'm also on TikTok. That's where I feel like I do most of my political stuff. I've got like a couple thousand followers. I don't have like that many, but like I do lots of stuff on TikTok. I found lots of really good communities on TikTok. And if you guys aren't on political TikTok, I highly recommend it. There's lots of really cool people that you can meet through doing that. And follow me on Twitter at Cassels David, on Instagram at Cassels David, and TikTok is also at Cassels David. So hit me up on all of those platforms. And yeah, thank you for having me on the show, Aiden. Thank you for putting this together. It really does mean the world. It's a good opportunity to share some of our thoughts and get to talk with other people and have good discussion and back and forths about these things that we really care a lot about. So thank you a lot for putting this together.
Yeah, you can follow me at lefty_mind. That's where I do 90% of my work, is all through Twitter, political activism. Yeah, that's it. Thanks again, Aiden, for having me on. It's great. I had a lot of fun. So yeah, thanks.
All right. Thank you yet again. Thanks so much for the audience for sticking around. Basically my Patreon and the Canada Files Patreon are there in the chat already if you want to support the work that I do, or directly support the institution and hopefully pay writers eventually. That really is the hope. So yeah, I guess other than that, my Twitter, I will quickly link to my Twitter. But if you want to follow me on Facebook, it's just Aiden Jonah. I do post there consistently. Twitter's probably the one that people are most connected on. It is just linked right below. Obviously, if you aren't on my Twitch right now watching this, it's twitch.tv/Aiden, AIDAN, underscore. The underline, JONAH. That is my Twitch. If you're already on Twitch and you're not following, please do follow. As I mentioned in the chat, basically, there's also a Canadian foreign policy news show, happens Wednesday, 7 p.m. Eastern time, pretty much every time, unless there's a timing change, which I will let people know of in advance. But yeah, other than that, thank you so much yet again to everyone. Thanks to the guests, thanks to the chat. And I am going to call an end to this. So thanks so much, everyone, and have a